Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem, welcome to today's Daf Yomi, which is YOMA Mem Hey. We begin 7 lines from the top of the Amud. Says the Gemara, B'chol yoyim makriv pras shachris upras ben harbayim. The Mishnah is highlighting some differences between Yom Kippur and what was typically done in the Beis HaMikdash. Typically they would have half the portion of Ketores brought in the morning, half in the afternoon. On Yom Kippur, they added an additional Maloi Chafnav, a handful. Another difference, B'chol Yom Daka. Typically it was finely ground Ketores, V'hayom Daka min hadaka. It was extra fine. Tanur Rabbanon, Daka. The pasuk in Achrim says that the Kohen Gadol will bring Maloi Chafnav, Ketores Samim Daka. He'll bring a handful of this finely ground Ketores. Why mention Daka? Typically the Ketores is meant to be ground, finely ground. Referring to any Ketores throughout the year. Ella, why then does this pasuk stipulate that when we speak about the Maloi Chafnav, that extra portion of Ketores for Yom Kippur, it needs to be Daka? Apparently, we're trying to upgrade it a bit further. It needs to be even more finely ground. Now, what is the shear? It's not clear. What constitutes Daka? What's Daka min Daka? The Brisker Rav says there really is no shear. The Gemara simply means you have to put it back into the mortar and do another grinding. It's sort of a covered Yom Kippur to be miyachet, to do an extra preparation for Yom Kippur, do an extra grinding job, and that enables us for Yom Kippur for the Maloi Chafnav, for Kodesh HaKadosh. Typically the Kohanim would ascend the Kevesh by way of the Mizrach perimeter and come down alongside the Marav side. Today the Kohen Gadol goes up and down along the middle. Now why was it so that the Kohen would go up through Mizrach and come down Marav? The Omar Mar, as we learned, called Pina Shata Pina. Whenever you take a turn, which direction should you go? In the Beis HaMikdash, you meant to go to the right. Lo yihu ela derech yamin lemizrach. So, for instance, we have the Kevesh and we have the Mizbeach. Suppose the Kohen had some business to do on the right side of the Mizbeach, or anyway alongside the Mizbeach. He would have to go, take a right turn, go around the Mizbeach. So as he's going up to Kevesh, he's going to have to turn to his right. Says the Gemara, since that's the case, that you have to go to the right, which in this case is towards Mizrach, because the Mizrach is over on this side, and Marav is off to the left of the Mizrach. He's going to have to turn to the right. Rather than just begin climbing up the Kevesh anywhere along the Kevesh, and then have to turn and sort of cross over the Kevesh to go towards the right, we try to minimize that walk around the Mizbeach. Mizbeach was a Mokim Korban, a Mokim Akrovan. We want to try to shorten that trip, not just roam around freely on the Mizbeach unnecessarily. Therefore, says the Mishnah, in order to shorten that trip, on his way up, he should ensure that he goes up the Mizrach of the Kevesh. So again, this will be the Kevesh, and he would go up the Mizrach side. So this way he goes around the Mizbeach and comes down the Marav side of the Kevesh without having to cross over the Kevesh unnecessarily. The Omar Mar, as we learned, called Pinoi Shata Poina Loyu Eli Derechim in the Mizrach. So when he's going to be going up to the Mizbeach to do something, he's going to have to turn to his right, towards Mizrach. So therefore, instead of starting the Aliyah on the Kevesh from the Marav, and then have to cross over to Mizrach to make his way around the Mizbeach, try to shorten that trip, just go up on the Mizrach side straight away, head over to the right, make a revolution around the Mizbeach, and come down on the Marav side of the Kevesh. This way he shortens his trip straight to the point. However, on Yom Kippur, the Kohen is Oila be'emtza, V'yored be'emtza. He goes up and down, straight to the middle, And the Gemara gives the reason. My taima mishum kvoided the Kohen Gadol on account of his kavod. Today, Rashi says he's going to express the chashivas and the love that Hashem has towards Klal Yisrael, who He represents. This is His day. This is the day of Kapara. Therefore, he just makes himself at home, walks up and down without any need to go shorten his route. There are two verses in the Gemara. It's either V'hayayim oile be'emtza v'yored be'emtza, referring specifically to the Kohen Gadol, or as the Rambam Pirsha Mishnah learns, oilin v'yardin, in reference not only to the Kohen Gadol but also to his helpers, the Iskan, the Reish Beis Av, who walk alongside the Kohen Gadol. They all have the same privilege. They all go up and down the middle of the kevish. B'chol yom Kohen Gadol mekadesh yodav v'raglav nakir. Typically, the Kohen Gadol will wash his hands and feet from the kir like everybody else. Today, from a golden pitcher. My time, why? Mishum kvodah shel Kohen Gadol, once again, on account of his kavod, set him apart from the rest of the Kohanim, give him that privilege of using a golden pitcher. Now we're going to go discuss the number of ma'rochis, the wood arrangements on the Mizbeach HaChit. We know that in Kippur we needed an extra ma'rocha. Why? To supply coals for use of that Malay Chafnav Ekteris in the Kodesh HaKadosh. All agree Yom Kippur featured an added ma'rocha. All agree as well that typically there were at least two ma'rochas on Mizbeach HaChitza. One, the larger one, Ma'rocha G'doila, on which they put the Korban Tamid and all other Korbanos throughout the day. There was a second one, a smaller one, to supply Gecholim coals for the Ketores. They would draw coals from the Mizbeach HaChitzin, bringing it to the Mizbeach HaPnimi, in the Hechel, which was actually also called Mizbeach HaZav, Mizbeach HaKetores, 3 names, and over there they would bring the Ketores, be marked to it in the Mizbeach HaPnimi. So the Mizbeach HaChitzin had to supply those coals, and therefore needed a special ma'rocha for that sake. That's agreed upon by all. At least 2 ma'rochas were needed. However, as we're going to learn soon, there's a shita that there were 3 ma'rochas. There's a shita that there were actually 4. On the Mizbeach HaChitzin typically, and of course in Yom Kippur, an additional one to supply coals for the Kodesh HaKadosh. Tana Rabban. B'chol yoyim hayusham hayushtayim ma'rochas. Typically, there were 2 ma'rochas on Mizbeach HaChitzin, Hayom Shalosh, and Yom Kippur 3. Achas Ma'rocha G'doila. The first one was the larger sized wood arrangement, on which they would bring the Karbanis. V'achas Ma'rocha Shniya Shal K'teres. The second one, a bit smaller, to supply coals for the K'teres. V'achas Shemoisifin Boi Bayayim. And on Yom Kippur, there was a third one, to supply coals for the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So typically 2, today 3. Rabbi Yossi Omer, B'chol Yom Shalosh, V'yom Arba. Typically, there were 3, and today 4. How's that? Where's the additional one? Achas Shemarocha G'doila, the first big one. V'achas Marocha Shniya Shal K'teres. The next one was the smaller sized to supply coals for the K'teres. So this was standard, 1 and 2. V'achas Shal Kiyum Haish. There was a third ma'rocha for the sake of Kiyum Haish. Some Rishonim learn just to keep a pilot fire on the Mizbeach, to keep a fire going throughout the day. This was a mitzvah. Rashi learns. And a practical application as well. Rashi says if the larger ma'rocha starts dying down and dissipating, you reinforce it using the wooden coals of this ma'rocha. So that was the point and purpose of this third ma'rocha. And of course in Yom Kippur we had another one. V'achas shemisifim b'bayayim, to supply coals for the Kodesh HaKadoshim. This is Shitas Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yehuda holds typically 2, today 3. Rabbi Yossi says standard was 3, today was 4. Rabbi Meir Omer, B'chol yoyim arba. Typically you had 4 ma'rochas on the Mizbeach HaChitzin, V'yom Chamish, and today went up to 5. How's that? Achas Shemarocha G'doila. V'achas Shemarocha Shniya Shal K'teres. V'achas Shel Kiyum Haish. So he agrees with Rabbi Yossi, there was an additional one for reinforcement, for maintenance. So we get to 3. V'achas, and a 4th one, leivarim updorim shlinis aklu mibarev, on which they burned the ivarim, the limbs, or the pdorim, the fats of yesterday's karbanis, shlinis aklu mibarev, which hadn't been consumed throughout the night. You used to make a special arrangement for that. These are leftovers. Yesterday's karbanis, they don't belong in the same ma'aracha as today's karbanis. So the 4th one was to address that. V'achas, and of course, the additional one for the sake of Yom Kippur, to supply gecholim for the K'teris Kodesh HaKadosh. So according to our Meir, we begin at 4 and we end at 5. Let's take a look at Rashi, 10 lines from the top. This was the extra one for Yom Kippur, explains Rashi for what purpose? Litoil mimenu gecholim the K'teris shalafnai lefnim, which was used to supply gecholim for the K'teris in the Kodesh HaKadosh. Aval K'teris shel mizbeach pnimi, points out Rashi. What about calls for the K'teris on Yom Kippur on the mizbeach pnimi? That was typical, that was standard. Harayu K'teris shel kol hashana. It was no different than the rest of the year, which was supplied by using the second maracha. Although it was Yom Kippur, the coals came from the same source as the rest of the year. The additional maracha was rather for the sake of supplying gecholim for that unique avodah, K'teris of Kodesh HaKadosh. Rabbi Yehuda says, we have an additional maracha shel kiyum ha'esh, explains Rashi, she'im ein eish, shel maracha gedolah mizgaber. We see even all of mizeh, we have to maintain and reinforce. The larger maracha, we draw from this one, we take some wood, some coals, to reinforce the larger maracha. Rabbi maintains there was an additional maracha as well, to accommodate the yesterday's Eivarim. Shlinis aklu shlnitnu al maracha, nitnu le'spikul as akil, either they weren't burnt, whether they weren't placed in the maracha to begin with, or they hadn't gotten a chance to be consumed. You need a special maracha for that. So once again, it's either standard 2, today 3, or typically 3, today is 4. According to our Meir, it jumped from 4 to 5. Continues the Gemara. Dekuli alma mias. It's pretty clear that all agree, Tarti Islam, that you have to have at least 2. They all agree. 2 marachas on the Mizbeach HaChitzon was standard. How do we know that there are 2 marachas? Amakro, the Pasuk says, the beginning of Tzav, Hi ha'oila al moikda. So the oil is meant to be on the wood arrangement. The burning wood, al moikda, al mizbeach, kol alayla. Zu maracha gedolah. This is the larger sized maracha for the oil. And the same pasuk continues, ve'esh ha-mizbeach tukad boy. Another lashon of tukad, of a fire arrangement, is referring to another arrangement. Zu maracha shnish al-k'teres. That was the smaller sized maracha for the k'teres. So the Gemara here will focus on several psukim, the beginning of Parashat Tzav. I'll just read it for you inside. I have it on the side of the Gemara. So we have the pasuk that we just mentioned, which is actually pasuk Beis. Tzav es Aaron es bon of Lemar, Zois teres ha'oila, hi ha'oila al moikta al mazbeach kol halayla. That's the first maracha for the oila. Ve'esh ha-mizbeach tukad boy. That's the second maracha to supply gecholim for the k'teres. We're going to have another pasuk. It's in close proximity. The pasuk Hey, which reads as follows: V'eish al mizbeach tukad boy lo sichpa, etc., etc. So we're going to focus on these 2 pasuk Beis and pasuk Hey. In pasuk Beis, we have a double mentioning of a maracha. It's easy to remember. Pasuk Beis has 2. Hi oila al moikta, that was a large maracha, and v'eish al mizbeach tukad boy, the smaller maracha, both contained in pasuk Beis. In pasuk Hey, we have another reference to some sort of fire, some sort of arrangement on the Mizbeach. Ve'esh al Mizbeach tukad boy lo sichpa, which the Gemara will focus on very soon. So far we have a source for the first 2 marachis. Again, they're both contained in pasuk Beis, which has 2 references, 2 wood arrangements. For Rabbi Yehuda Kessler, from where did Rabbi Yehuda learn the 3rd maracha to supply and maintain the other maracha, kiyum ha'esh? Nafkalei, he learns it from pasuk Hey, which reads as follows: Miva eish al mizbeach tukad boy, to tell you another maracha was needed. Rabbi Yehuda, now Rabbi Yehuda disagreed. We only have 2 marachas. What does he do with that pasuk? Hahu la tzasas al yisa hudasa. It's coming to tell you Let's suppose they have to kindle some twigs, some splinters. Suppose they see the marocha is quieting down, dying down. They have to reinvigorate it by tossing up some splinters, some twigs, to get the logs going again. Or some Mepharshim say to ignite the firewood to begin with. Either way, what he's doing is he's grabbing a couple of sticks, lighting them on fire, and tossing it into the in between the logs and the mizbeach to get the whole thing going. The question is whether he can do that down on the floor, light those twigs and toss it onto the mizbeach. It's going to get embedded and bottled to the marocha. So it's irrelevant of where he's lighting those twigs. Or do we say, no, since these twigs will become part and parcel of that marocha, they need to be lit on the mizbeach in its proper place. Says Rabbi Yehuda, yes, it has to be on the mizbeach, and we learn it from this pasuk. Rabbi Yehuda hula tzosas al yisa. It's called aliyah, like a tail, thin, long sticks of wood. Who the us is coming to tell you regarding that? How exactly? This Tanya. We learned in the place. How do we know this halacha? That kindling those twigs also must take place on the mizbeach. You can't just light them on the floor beside the mizbeach and then pick them up and put them on the mizbeach. Talmud Leimar. That's why we have this pasuk hey, v'eish al mizbeach to goodbye, to tell you that even this type of kindling must take place on the mizbeach. It's part of the mizbeach. It's part of the marocha, and the appropriate place for kindling is on the mizbeach. Rabbi Yossi, the Brisa continues. Actually, I'm going to use that pasuk for the third marocha. Rabbi Yossi, menayin she'oseh marocha l'kiyuma eish. How do I know that you meant to create another marocha for kiyuma eish, as we explained earlier, to use that marocha to supply the other marocha from it, to reinvigorate, to maintain the other marocha using this marocha? How do we know that? Talmud Leimar, this very pasuk hey, v'eish al mizbeach to goodbye. So that's the Bryce. We have a pasuk hey, which reads v'eish al mizbeach to goodbye. Could you see? That's informing us regarding the third marocha, which is needed on a regular basis. Marocha l'kiyuma eish. Rabbi says there was no such marocha. It's teaching us about hatzosas al yasa. Rabbi Yossi hatzosas al yasa minoli. How does Rabbi Yossi know this halach? He meant to kindle those splinters on the mizbeach and not on the floor below, and then throw them onto the mizbeach. He better use this pasuk. For his sake, he no longer has an available pasuk for this chiddush. Nafkale, he will derive it mehecha, to Nafkale Reb Shimon, from the same address as Reb Shimon. Where does Reb Shimon learn this halacha from? From a different pasuk, a pasuk in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra. This time, v'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish al mizbeach. What is the pasuk teaching us? Limeid al tzatzas al yasa, sheloi tehei, ela b'kohen kasher, ubekli sharas, div Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda learns from this pasuk that not only igniting the marocha initially, the beginning of the YOMA avoda, needed a kohen, but anything that's happening on the mizbeach, including hatzatas al yasa, which we just learned, Rabbi Yehuda himself just told us, needs to be done on the mizbeach itself. Meaning, not only initiating the fire at the outset of the YOMA avoda, but even throughout the day, if there's some sort of weakening in that fire, and you have to reinvigorate it, refresh the fire, you throw some splinters into that marocha to get it going again, which needed to be done on the mizbeach. All that needs a kohen wearing klei shoras, meaning bigdei kahuna. Amar Rabbi Shimon responds, look, you just told me that a tzotas al yasa can only be done on the mizbeach. If so, why would you need a pasuk to tell you they need a kohen for that? Who else is going to engage with the mizbeach? Who else is going to do things on the mizbeach if not a kohen? V'chisal al datach. Couldn't even contemplate shezar curb l'gam mizbeach, that a non-kohen will approach and engage with the mizbeach. You don't need a pasuk to tell you that hatzotas al yasa needs a kohen. It's pashut. If it's on the Mizbeach, it needs a kohen. Rather, it says Reb Shimon. The pasuk is telling you a more basic halach. Ela limed al tzatas al yosa sheloi tehei ela b'rosh hamizbeach. The pasuk which says v'nosnu me'aron ish al hamizbeach is coming to tell you that very halach that you learned from the other pasuk Hey, which wasn't available for me because I already used it for my purpose to tell you about the third ma'aracha l'kim eish. That very same halacha I'm going to learn from this pasuk. V'nosnu me'aron hakohen eish al hamizbeach is coming to tell you al hamizbeach that when you kindle those twigs, that kindling must take place on the mizbeach. You can't ignite it down on the floor and throw it on the mizbeach. So according to Reb Shimon, we now have a source for that halacha. That atzatas al yosa needs to take place on the mizbeach itself, leaving the other pasuk Hey, which reads v'eish al mizbeach tukadvay lo yisichve, to inform us regarding that third ma'aracha l'kim eish. What does Rabbi Yehuda respond to Reb Shimon? Shimon asked him, Akash, he says, if atzatas al yosa is on the mizbeach, why would you think a zar can do that? Rabbi Yehuda, he says like this, if only from that other pasuk Hey, from which I derive this din of atzatas al yosa on the mizbeach, perhaps I would say, Havamina, even a zar could do it. Although it has to be lit on the mizbeach. Even those twigs have to be lit on the mizbeach because they're part of the maracha, but maybe somehow zar could arrange to get them lit. Havamina koya ar, while he's standing on the floor beside the mizbeach, I'll just take some sort of a blower and blow until he gets the logs ignited again. So perhaps a zar can do that. He's not engaging with the mizbeach, he's standing alongside the mizbeach. Kamash Malon, that's why we need a pasuk to tell us no. That everything needs to be done by a kohen. Not only lighting the maracha to begin with, but even refreshing the maracha needs a kohen. And Taisus explains, apparently Reb Shimon, who presented this as an argument against Rabbi Yehuda, what do you need a pasuk to tell you kohen? It's pashut. A zar can't approach the mizbeach. Taisus says Reb Shimon apparently held it's not respectful for a zar to be standing near the mizbeach and blowing away on the mizbeach to try to get it going. This wasn't even part of the repertoire. It wasn't part of the equation here. We had no havamina that this could work. And therefore, if you have to be on the mizbeach, there must be a kohen. You don't need a pasuk for that. Rather, the pasuk is coming to tell you the ikar din, that lighting these splinters must take place on the mizbeach, leaving that other pasuk Hey, available to inform us regarding that additional maracha l'kim eish. Let's take a look at Rashi, 7 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yehuda Amalach, imehasam, if only from that other pasuk Hey, mehasam me'eish al mizbeach, avagav da shamina mino, shatzata b'reish mizbeach. Although certainly we learn from there that kindling those splinters takes place on the mizbeach, but still leisham inan the psul b'zar, we won't know that a zar can't do that. Havamina koyizar ara v'mapucha. He'll stand there by and blow away. And that's why we need a pasuk to tell you that a kohen is needed. So in conclusion, we had pasuk Hey, Eish HaMizbeach tukad b'lo sichbe, which according to Rabbi Yossi tells us to make that extra maracha l'kim eish. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no, you don't need an extra maracha for that sake. The Miri explained, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Kohen would just bring wood from the outside and supply and resupply the maracha. You don't need to resupply from within the mizbeach, which is apparently Rabbi Yosef's shita. Even when you have a maintenance issue, you have to go bring from inside. It has to be supplied from within the mizbeach. That's why we need a special maracha for that sake. Rabbi disagrees. He says we don't need a maracha for that sake. Rather, this pasuk of Eish HaMizbeach is coming to tell you another chiddush. Suppose you have to refresh the mizbeach and you want to get some splinters kindled and have them tossed into the maracha between the logs. Can you light them below and then throw them in? Because in any case, they're going to be bottled to the maracha. It's going to be part of the maracha eventually. No, it has to be lit on the mizbeach itself. They have chashivas. They're like firewood of the mizbeach, and they have their own chashivas. You can't just light it below and throw it into the fire and let it be bottled. You have to light it on the mizbeach itself. The question was, how does Rabbi Yossi know this halacha? The answer was, he derives it from a pasuk, the beginning of Parshas Vayikra. But in any case, all agree that the lighting process, whether lighting the maracha initially or lighting it eventually, reinvigorating, refreshing it, that needs a kohen. Not only a kohen, but wearing bigdei kehuna as well, and that's all included in the pasuk. V'nosnu b'nei Aaron a kohen. Why does the pasuk speak about a kohen? For this very purpose. Lighting the mizbeach requires a kohen. Continues the Gemara. We have another shita. We discussed Rabbi Yehuda. Typically do 2 marachos. Rabbi Yossi holds 3. Rabbi holds 4. What's the fourth one all about? Reb Meir Eivarim Upedorim. The fourth one was to accommodate the leftovers from yesterday, the Eivarim, the Pedorim, the Chalavim, Shlonis Akum Berev, that were not consumed throughout the night. Minolaim, has he know that you need to make a special maracha to accommodate those Eivarim and Pedorim rather than just tossing them to the new maracha, the big one? Nafkalei, he learns it from an extra vav, because in pasuk Beis, which reads Ve'esh al Mizbeach Tukad Boy, we seem to have an extra vav, Ve'esh, and that's the source for this maracha. Nafkalei mi Ve'esh, to tell you a fourth maracha. V'Rabbanan vav lidashi, they hold that a vav, although sometimes we do use it as a drasha, but here, not to this extent that we're going to make a new maracha, a new place, a new eish for this purpose. V'Rabbanan Eivarim Upedorim Shlonis Aklum Be'erev Ma'yavilu. But the Rabbanan, what are we meant to do with these items? What do we burn them? Mahadavu Marcha G'dayla. You simply put them back into the Marcha G'dayla. They don't need their own marach. They're leftovers from yesterday. They just go back to the same place and get consumed there. The Sanyo Menayin Leivarim Pedorim Shlonis Aklum Be'erev. How do we know regarding these Eivarim Pedorim which are not consumed throughout the night? So this is going to be the Shitas Chachamim. He's going to return them to the Maracha, but in the meantime, this is in the morning when he has to clean up the Mizbeach and rearrange the fire. So he takes the Eivarim and puts them somewhere on the side of the Mizbeach. And if there's no room, there's not enough space on Mizbeach, she places them on the ramp, on the walkway, which protrudes from the side of the Mizbeach. He leaves them there temporarily, until he completes the Marach G'dayla, and then puts them back in the Marach G'dayla. They don't need their own Marach. Talmud Leimar, we learn this from a pasuk. This is the pasuk beginning of Vayikra Vav. This is in Tzav once again. Pasuk Gimel says, "V'hira misadeshna shateichel eish esa oila al hamizbeach." Why again reference the word oila al hamizbeach? As Rashi points out, we already know the oila belongs in the mizbeach because we have that other pasuk in pasuk Beis which said hi oila al maikta. So what's the point of this pasuk? Tamaloy masha teichel eish esa oila al hamizbeach. It's going to tell you, just put them back. You don't have to have an omar racha. You have to go put them back on the same place and have them burn in the same aracha as the oila. So the chiddush is that they're meant to be put back. You don't just take them off. A new day, a new carpet. No. Even yesterday's leftovers are meant to go back and be burnt on the mizbeach. And we don't necessarily have a raya, say the Rabbanan, that they need their own marach. The stumma of the pasuk is just put them back where they came from. Tosfos points out, why does the Brisa say that you place them on the mizbeach, on the kevesh of the soiviv? Says Tosfos something very important. You can't put them down on the floor. Even on the yisoid you can't put them. Why? Because they will become pasobelina by having been left overnight. And then they're no longer right from the mizbeach. Rather, you place them on an area which is halachically regarded as mizbeach. We know that in lina my elas broshim mizbeach. When you have something on the mizbeach, he's home. You don't become pasul there, even if they're left overnight. So the mizbeach has that halacha. The kevesh, the soivev, it's a chiddush, even the soivev, and therefore leave the Eivarim there until you're done doing the maracha, and you put them back on the mizbeach. Another pshat says maybe there's even an isser to remove them completely from the mizbeach. Rather, you leave them there until you have to be able to put them back on the maracha. Rabbi Meir holds that you meant to make a new ma'aracha for the Vorma P'darim of yesterday. What does Rabbi Meir do with this pasuk, which indicated to us that the Ivarim go back where they came from, on the ma'aracha g'doila of the Talmud? Rabbi Meir, ikulu oila atamachser, the pasuk which says asher toichal ha'esh es oila mizbeach, is coming to tell us that only an oila has this halacha. These partially consumed oila parts must be returned. Atamachser, v'atamachser, ikulik teres. But that doesn't apply to the ikulik teres. Suppose we have some granules of teres which were not fully consumed, and they're in the mizbeach pnimi. Next day comes around. Do you have to go ahead and put them back on the fire and have them burn further? No. There's a difference between the mizbeach achitzen, which is a makom, and once the carbon is up there, you leave it up there and you let it burn throughout. Whereas the mizbeach pnimi, perhaps as far as that it's a klisharis, it's a movable thing. It doesn't have the same halacha as the makom mizbeach achitzen, and the klisharis is mekadosh and it has a purpose, has a function. Once you've done the aktoras k'toras, it's a new day. There's no point in putting the k'toras back onto the mizbeach and back into the fire. And that's what he uses this pasuk for. The pasuk stresses that this return procedure only applies to oila, not to k'toras. The Tani Reb Chan, and by the way, the Mefarshim points out that it's not only oila. Anything on the mizbeach achitzen, kaimetz levayna, will have this halacha that you meant to put it back on the fire the next day. The Tani Reb Chananya, Bar Bar Yumi, B'dvei Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, he presented the Brisa and the Besmedrash Lezer ben Yaakov that we use this pasuk for this purpose. Asher toichel ha'esh es oila mizbeach. It's coming to tell us only ikuli oila, these partially consumed oila parts, atamachser, v'atamachser, ikuli k'teres, but this doesn't apply to the consumed k'teres. So in conclusion, we have machlokes, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Meir holds we need a special ma'aracha to accommodate yesterday's leftovers. Rabbanan say no, just put it back into the ma'aracha g'doila of the Talmud. The Ramban actually says that according to Rabbi Meir, a new pious, a new lottery, a new finger count was conducted to see who's going to be zeicha to do this task, returning the Ivarim onto the Mizbeach into this new ma'aracha. Perhaps it would seem from the Rabban that the Rabbanon, they don't subscribe to a new pious. And the svar would be that according to Rabbi Meir, it says Vodah Chashuva, it's like a new job. It's a new Haktorah for today. We don't view them simply as leftovers. You need a new Maracha, it's a new Avodah, which requires a new pious to determine who's going to be lucky kind to do it. Whereas the Rabban hold, it's just leftovers from yesterday. You don't need to make a big deal about it. It goes back to the same old Maracha, and no new finger count is needed. Perhaps it's the same kind that did it yesterday, will do it today, or perhaps any kind that happens to be there. It's not considered a new avodah on its own, and therefore it doesn't need a new marach. Let's go back to the Gemara. The Kuli Alma Mias, but it's pretty clear that all agree, all shittas, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Meir, Moisifim Bavayim Islam, they all agree that on Yom Kippur you meant to add a new maracha, which was used to supply the gecholim for the Ketores brought in the Kodesh HaKadosh. Minalu. How did they know a new maracha was needed for that? Nafkalu. They learned it from the pasuk Hey, Mi v'ha'esh. V'esh al mizbeach tuka d'boile istichbe. And all of the pasuk was already applied for something, but we have a ribu. V'ha. Vavaneh. Which tells you a new maracha is needed for Yom Kippur. Now, even the Rabban who earlier didn't go along with Rabbi Meir's additional ma'aracha based on the Vav, however, Vav Hey Dorish. Here it's more than just a Vav, it's Vav and Hey, which denotes more ribui, and it's coming to tell us that you have to go ahead and make a new ma'aracha for Yom Kippur. Okay, so in summary, we have three shittas. Rabbi Meir holds 4 marachas was standard. Rabbi Yossi says 3. Rabbi Yehuda says 2. Let's work first with Psukim in the beginning of Parshas Tzav. We have Pasuk Beis and Pasuk Hey. In Pasuk Beis, we have a double mention of a fire arrangement. Then we have Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy. We have Pasuk Hey, once again, Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy. Then we're going to have another Pasuk, V'nosim Aaron HaKohen Yesh HaMizbeach, which is in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra. Let's go back to the beginning. The Pasuk Beis, Hi'oil Moita, not everybody agrees, is referring to the great Maracha Gdoila, meant for the Karban Tamid and all Karbanos throughout the day. The second Maracha is learned from the second part of Pasuk Beis. Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy. That's a smaller Maracha for the Ketores, to supply Gecholim throughout the year, for the Ketores brought in the Mizbeach HaPnimi in the Heichel. Rabbi Meir says, the Vav of Ve'esh is informing us of an additional Maracha to accommodate yesterday's leftovers, Eivarim or Pedorim, Shlonis Aklu Berev. We have Pasuk Hey, Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy. Now, all agree that the Veha, the extra Vav in the Hey, is coming to tell us that in Yom Kippur, you needed an extra Maracha. So that's agreed upon by all. What about the main function of the Pasuk? What's that coming to tell us? Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy, according to Rabbi Meir, and according to Rabbi Yossi, that we need another Maracha for Kiyum HaEsh, to be used to supply wood and coals to maintain the large Maracha. So that's why, according to Rabbi Meir, we now have 4 Marachas: the Gdoila, the Ketores, the Eivarim, and Kiyum HaEsh. According to Rabbi Yossi, we now have 3 Marachas: Gdoila, Ketores, and Kiyum HaEsh. Rabbi Yehuda maintains, no, there's no Kiyum HaEsh. What is this Pasuk? Pasuk Hey coming to tell us? Ve'esh Al HaMizbeach Tukad Boy. Even when you go ahead and you light those little splinters to reinvigorate the Maracha, you can't do it on the floor below. You have to go ahead and light them on the Mizbeach itself. Hatzotas Al Yosah Shtei Reish HaMizbeach. And finally we have the Pasuk in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, V'nostem in Aaron HaKohen Eish HaMizbeach. According to Rabbi Meir, and according to Rabbi Yossi, the Pasuk here will tell us, Eish Al HaMizbeach. The fire always has to begin on the Mizbeach, that Tatas Al Yosah. These take place on the Mizbeach itself. It's part of the Maracha wood. You have no business lighting it on the floor and then tossing it onto the Mizbeach. What else do we learn from this Pasuk? That a kohen is needed all throughout. Whether when it comes to lighting the Mizbeach, whether when it comes to relighting the Mizbeach and refreshing the Maracha, everything needs to be done by a kohen. That's what the Pasuk says. V'nostem le'aron HaKohen kohenesh. To tell you about a kohen. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this Pasuk was not going to tell us about a Tatas Al Yosah, because he said that we learned that from the other Pasuk. Rather, the Pasuk is simply telling us that everything needs to be done by a kohen. V'nostem le'aron HaKohen Eish HaMizbeach. Continues the Gemara. We discussed all the Psukim. We have one more Pasuk, which we haven't yet addressed. Eish Tamid. This is Pasuk Vav, beginning of Parshas Tzav, which reads like this: Eish Tamid Tukad HaMizbeach Lo Yisichbe. What's that Pasuk coming to tell us? Eish Tamid L'mayasa. Min Boileg the Sanya, it's needed for the following brisa. Let's begin the brisa with the Girsas Hagra. The Girsas Hagra replaces the Pasuk. Instead of Eish Tamid as we have it, it's meant to read Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy, which is back to Pasuk Beis, beginning of Parshas Tzav, Pasuk Beis. Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy Leisich. What's it coming to tell us? Limed Amaracha Shniya Shal Ketores Sheloi Tehei Ela HaMizbeach HaChitza. It's coming to tell us that the Maracha Shniya, that second smaller sized Maracha, which supplies coals for the Ketores, is meant to be out on the Mizbeach HaChitza. Meaning, fine, you need a special Maracha for the Ketores, but how do you know where it's meant to be? How do you determine its location? Maybe it's meant to be in the Mizbeach HaPnimi. No. We learn from the Pasuk that it's meant to be on the Mizbeach HaChitza. Ve'esh HaMizbeach Tukad Boy, right there, together with the first Marach. Now what about the fire and coals? which will supply the machta, the Yom Kippur Ketores, or the fire which is used to kindle the menorah. Where does that come from? How do you know that it's coming from the Mizbech HaChitzon? Eish machta, the fire for the machta, meaning the coals, which he scoops out, what is machta for the Ketores and Kodesh HaKadoshim and Kippur. U'menorah, and the fire for the menorah on a daily basis. Minayin, how do we know that it originates in Mizbech HaChitzon? Says Rabbi Yehuda, I'll draw a simple comparison. Nemra Eish B'Kteris. We find Eish by Kteris on a daily basis. V'nemra Eish B'Machto Menorah. We find fire for the Machto Yom Kippur and the Menorah. Ma'ala Halon on Mizbech HaChitzon. Just as the typical Kteris was supplied from the Mizbech HaChitzon, the coals were drawn from there. Avkan on Mizbech HaChitzon here as well. The fire for the Machto Yom Kippur and the fire to light the Menorah comes from Mizbech HaChitzon. Let's just stop for a second. Take a look at Rashi. Third line from the top. Eish Tamad Tukad Mayasa. We have one leftover pasuk. Given the dashers kol moiktes in yana, you focus on all the moiktes, all the psukim. What about this pasuk? Shaloite al mizbech hachitin. We begin the brisa, going back to the pasuk beis, which tells us ve'esh mizbech tukad boy, that the coals used to supply the Ketores on a daily basis comes from mizbech hachitin daimel kram mizbech oilaksiv. Very pasuk. This pasuk is speaking about the mizbech for the oila mizbech hachitin. So we know that there has to be a firewood arrangement for the Ketores. And we also know, where was it? What about Eish Machta U'Menorah? Eish Yom Kippurim L'Fnei L'Fnim. The coals used to supply the Machta for the sake of the Ketores and Kodesh HaKadoshim. Ve'eish the Menorah, that lokas neiros, the Chol Yom, the flame for the Menorah. Minay should tell us, Mizbech HaChitzon. How do you know it comes from Mizbech HaChitzon? Continues Rashi. Hochi Garsinan, Nemar Kan, Eish B'Kteris, the Chsiv Yaktirena, Ve'en Aktor B'Leish. So the pasuk, the Gemara says that by Kteris we have the word Eish. What do we have Eish by Kteris? So Rashi says it's not really a word Eish. It says Yaktirena. You can't be mocked without a fire. Tosis actually learns. It's from a pasuk by Korach. Atav Aaron Ish Machtosai Usnu Bahen Eish V'Simulein Kteris. So you find the term Eish applied by Kteris. That's what the Gemara meant. In either case, the Gemara at this point figures, I'm going to learn the Eish of Machtas Yom Kippur, the Eish of Menorah, from the Eish of Ketores. Just as your typical Ketores comes from Mizbech HaChitzon, the same applies to Yom Kippur's Machta and the Menorah on a daily basis. Or perhaps take a different route, which won't really work out for you. Nemra Eish B'Kteres. We find fire by Ketores on a typical day. V'nemra Eish B'Machta U'Menorah. We found Eish on Yom Kippur and by Menorah. Ma lahalam b'samach loi. Just as the coals used to supply the Ketores on a daily basis comes from where? B'samachloi, from nearby. What does that mean? The final destination is the Mizbech HaPnimi, Mizbech HaZah, Mizbech HaKetores in the Heichal. Where does he draw his coals from? Mizbech, nearby, his neighbor, Mizbech HaChitzon. Af Machto Menorah b'samachloi. Likewise, the fire, the coals for the Machta, for Kodesh HaKadoshim and Kippur, or for the Menorah, will come from where? Something close by. Who's the Menorah's neighbor? Mizbech HaPnimi. Who's closer to the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Mizbech HaChitzon or Mizbech HaPnimi Neichel? Of course Mizbech HaPnimi. Perhaps they meant to draw their fire from Mizbech HaPnimi, not from Mizbech HaChitzon. Talmud Loimar. That's why we need that pasuk, which is pasuk Vav in Parashat Tzav. Eish Tamid Tukad Amazbech Leisichbe, which comes to tell us Eish Tamid Shamatilcha. That fire, that constant fire, that's the Menorah. Lahalos Ner Tamid. That fire, Loi Tehei El Abroishoi Shemazbech HaChitzon, comes from where? Mizbech HaChitzon, which this pasuk is referring to. Okay, so now we know 2 out of 3. Lomadnu Eish LaMenorah. We know that the fire for the Menorah comes from Mizbech HaChitzon, and we also know that the coals for the Ketores on a daily basis came from Mizbech HaChitzon. We have one which we're not sure yet. Eish LaMachta Menayin. What about the fire for Yom Kippur? Says the Gemara, okay, we'll draw a parallel. V'dinu Nemra ish b'machta, we find fire by the machta Yom Kippur. B'nemra ish b'menorah, we find by the menorah. Mala halon al gab mizbech hachitzon, just as the menorah comes from the mizbech hachitzon, as we just concluded. Afkana mizbech hachitzon, the machta Yom Kippur also draws from the mizbech hachitzon. Oiklach al derech zu, perhaps shift things around, in which case you won't have a conclusion. Learn from someplace else. Nemra ish b'kteres, we find fire by kteres, the daily kteres. B'nemra ish b'machta, we find ish on Yom Kippur. Just as on a daily basis, where do you draw the calls for the K'turis in Mizbech HaPnimi? Samachle, from his neighbor, from Mizbech HaChitzin. Afkan b'samachle. The same thing in Yom Kippur. The calls for Kodesh HaKadoshim will be drawn from the closest Mizbech HaPnimi, not Chitzin. Tamad Laimar. That's why we have another pasuk, and this is in the parsha of Yom Kippur and Achri Mois. V'lokach m'lei amachto g'achlei eish me'al mizbeach m'lfnei Hashem. That's where he takes his gechol from. Ezo mizbeach. Which mizbeach are we speaking about? Which is me'al mizbeach milifnei Hashem, which indicates that he takes coals from the portion of the mizbeach, from the location of the mizbeach, which is lifnei Hashem, which is facing to Marav. Apparently this Mizbeach is facing in all directions. You have to take from the Marav facing side, Ezel Mizbeach, Shemik Tzotzel Lifnei Hashem, Ve'in Kula Lifnei Hashem. Which one? Which Mizbeach features this characteristic? It's partially facing Hashem, partially facing the Heichel, and partially not. You have two candidates. Mizbeach HaPnimi, which is completely Lifnei Hashem in the Heichel, or Mizbeach HaChitzin, who only somewhat faces Lifnei Hashem. Havi Omer is a Mizbech HaChitzin. Apparently it's Mizbech HaChitzin, and that's where he takes his clothes from on Yom Kippur. So now we have a conclusion. All fires, whether K'turis on a typical day, whether the flame for the menorah, or whether coals for Yom Kippur, were drawn from Mizbech HaChitzin. Now the pasuk says, Lifnei Hashem, Me'al Mizbech, Lifnei Hashem. Why the double lashon? V'yitzrich l'michtav Me'al Mizbech, the pasuk finds it necessary to mention both terms, Mizbeach and Lifnei Hashem. Why? Because Rachman Me'al Mizbeach. Had the Torah only said Me'al Mizbeach, Havamina, Mizbeach Pnimi. I would say perhaps it's the Mizbeach HaPnimi. Because Rachman Lifnei Hashem to tell you it's the Mizbeach HaChitzain, which only partially faces the Heichel, or the Pesach HaHeichel. Because Rachmana Lifnei Hashem, had the Torah only said Lifnei Hashem, Havamina Davka Lifnei Hashem, I would say perhaps he could only draw coals which are actually facing Hashem. Rashi says Keneged Pesach Mamish, only those coals which are directly opposite the Pesach of the Heichel. Aval Mehai Gisa, Umehai Gisa, Emeloi. But perhaps the coals on either side, which aren't directly facing the Pesach of the Heichel, perhaps they're not suitable. And the Chatchil you should take directly facing, but the Eved, you're Yotze there as well. Perhaps no, you're not Yotze. Sricha, that's why the pasuk has to use both terms, Lifnei Hashem, and also Me'al Mizbeach, to tell you that it's kosher even along the sides. So, in conclusion, we were looking for the makar of the following halachas. What are you meant to draw the gecholim for your k'turis throughout the year? What are you meant to draw the fire for the menorah, or the coals for Yom Kippur's machta? They all come from Mizbech HaChitzin. K'turis, we learn pasuk beis ve'eshem Mizbech tukat boy. It's meant to be drawn from the fire, from the Mizbech HaChitzin, the tukat boy, which is the makom of the oila discussed in that pasuk. Menorah comes from Mizbech HaChitzin because the pasuk says eish tamid tukat HaMizbech, which comes to be marba the eish of the menorah. And again, we're speaking about that same Mizbech oila. Regarding the machta Yom Kippur, we have a pasuk which says v'lokach m'lei machta g'achlei eish me'al Mizbech v'nei Hashem, which indicates that it's a Mizbech which is partially facing Hashem, partially facing the Heichel, partially westward facing, and partially not. It can't be the Mizbech HaPnimi, which is in the Heichel itself. That is Lifnei Hashem. Apparently we're speaking about a Mizbech which is outside, and only facing partially the Heichel. Apparently we're speaking about Mizbech HaChitzin. Okay, let's focus on some main points of today's daf. We began with some differences between Yom Kippur and your typical day in the Beis Hamikdash, the Ketores in Yom Kippur needed to be Dakum and Adaka. And Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would just walk up and down the middle of the Kevesh and wash himself using that golden pitcher. How many marachas were there on the Mizbeach? We have 3 shittas. All agree you needed at least 2. That was standard. One was the Maracha G'dola, one was the Maracha Shniya Shal Ketores. All agree that in Yom Kippur you added one, which was used to supply the Gecholim for the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. I'm going to learn that from our pasuk. So what was your total? Well, it depends on your starting point. Who was Rabbi Yehuda? He began with 2, and in Yom Kippur you ended with 3. Because Rabbi Yossi began with 3, because you had another one, L'kiyum Ha'ish. In Yom Kippur you ended with 4. Because Rabbi Meir, you started with 4. The additional one was to accommodate yesterday's Ibarim Ptarim. In Yom Kippur you ended with 5. And we concluded with a makar that the coals and fire used for the Ketores throughout the year, or Yom Kippur, or for the menorah, all came from the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Kol Tzir Tiyun Atzlacha Rabbah.